In this short video, I will discuss several aspects of strategy that typically is what instructional design is about, and that's related to ways to align your course structure with your assessment. And I'll start with two typical types of strategy. The first one, it's the reactive one, and the second one is the proactive one, or the instructional design. The reactive one is pretty much what you do, or most of the instructors do. You start with, getting a textbook and, looking at what's important in that textbook. Then you organize everything you think is important for your topic in different chapters, sections, weeks, and finally slides. Then you go and deliver the content. Basically, you talk about what's happening. And in the end, you start to think about, oh, by the way, I have to assess the students, how I do it. What's happening very often in these situations, because you just start with the content, at the end you think about the assessment, you will end up with assessment that doesn't match your content or what you thought you asked the students to learn or you focused on, and very often the students will be unhappy, and they sometimes are right, not necessarily all the time, but usually if you proceed this way, they will be clearly unsatisfied. The instructional design starts with a totally different approach. You start by defining learning outcomes and objectives, and we'll discuss mainly about this in what's remaining here. Then you write some sample tests for the very, very important outcomes. Then you select the content for these important outcomes, deliver the content, and then you set up some classroom activities so that you make sure they get it during the classroom, not only at the end of the course. And this is called formative feedback. It's formative because you provide students, and students are giving you feedback about how much they know. You provide them with feedback about how much at that time they know, but this is not a punishment because will not be associated with significant points that will impact their grade. And finally, once you finish a certain section or at the midterm and the final, you have that summative feedback. That's pretty much your test, the exam. What this structure helps you is to figure it out that from between each steps you can go and change. So you can determine if what you can write is actually possible with what you defined before. So for each of these steps, it's a kind of systemic approach to designing the courses. Of course, you have to start with this and have an instructional designer to help you from EdTech in this case, and pick the major topics to start with. I will now focus mainly on the first step that's problematic most of the times because it's not something that you went through, but most certainly you heard about it. What are learning objectives and outcomes? If you look at the program level, then you have learning goals. This is what your university is usually setting up, and they are pretty much complex and multifaceted, so they are a little bit more generic. If you go at the course level, here you have objectives. These are more specific, and you have to focus here on achievement. And finally, when you go at the lesson level or the topic level, here you have the outcomes. This is what you will use to create your test items that will align with what you taught. Here it's a modified version of Bloom taxonomy. You'll hear about this. That's too complex to discuss about it, but I will focus on this part. This is the cognitive processes that describe different types of learning outcomes, and I will go through all of this so that you'll have an idea about how they will be useful in your case. in general, when you look at that taxonomy, Anderson and colleagues, that's a modified Bloom's taxonomy. That's one of the basic one used in educational research. You have learning objectives. It's pretty much like what you will say. The students will remember, will be able to understand, apply, analyze. But these are generic objectives. I mean, they are not very specific. They cannot help you define a learning outcomes and set up a clear assessment. Because for each of these, if you look at the first one, remember there are at least two of them. If you go at the highest level, creating, there are several, and I will go through all this shortly. Remember, it's the basic level of the cognitive processes you will look for when you teach something. To be able to define remembering, you can use two verbs, recognize and recall. Recognize, and when you provide a list of alternative answers, and they have to recognize the one that it's associated with your questions. Recall, it's when you ask the students to retrieve from the memory, long-term memory, a piece of information, and one example of this one is fill in the blanks. So pretty much here is multiple choices. Here is with one answer, valid answer, and here is a fill in the blank. This is the lowest level, and it's a tricky part because remember it can be a result of everything you do, and that's what's left. Or it can be something that you want them to do, and it's your goal. When it's your goal, you'll set up questions and activity that will focus on recognizing and recalling on these two. When this is a result of everything you did, then you use them only as a test of how much they recognize and how much they recall of important information. Understand, very often people will say, I want them to understand. What do you mean? You see only few, and there are more. Interpret, exemplify, classify, infer, explain. All these are verbs that describe understanding. So, for example, you cannot say, I want my students to understand this law. You have to say, my students are able to interpret different documents that discuss this law. They are able to provide example of different applications of that law. They are able to classify different situations where the law is valid. They have to infer. They have to explain. As you go through this list, you can see that as you go to the bottom of the screen, the cognitive engagement is higher. So understanding can be as low as just interpreting something, and as high as having somebody explaining what they understood, what are the causes of an event. For example, causality, it's one pretty tough cookie for everybody to digest and understand. So explaining a causal relationship, it's a pretty good example of a difficult type of activity that students have to do to show that they really understood something. Apply, you either execute and implement. The difference is here it's for the procedures. The students, you give them a procedure like in the lab, and they just execute it. Implement is when they have to determine a specific situation where that procedure or a specific law will be appropriate. So you go one step above the executing a procedure, but you ask them to also decide in which situation that procedure is valid. Analyze, again, when you say, I want my students to be able to analyze, you can ask them to differentiate relevant versus irrelevant, to organize specific structure, or to attribute or determine a point of view. In this case, one example of a researcher based on his or her professional perspective. So there are levels that you can ask the students, and all of this can be translated in a assessment item. My students will be able to differentiate between relevant and irrelevant facts associated with this topic, or something like this. So you have verbs that help you actually craft assessment items. Evaluate, check, and critique, same issue, 2 different levels. Create, the highest level of Bloom's taxonomy goes from actually you generate, you plan, and you produce. And this produce is pretty much the highest end when you have to understand and also have the skills to build something. To produce, it can be, in this case, a machine, or it can be a pretty complex structure based on, it can be real life or can be virtual. So you have, as long as you produce something that is associated with your topic, that's pretty important. Very often you cannot stay only with objectives, because you have authentic tasks in your professional activity that pretty much take all these high-level type of objectives and just combine them in so-called portable skills. When you have something like this, when this is pretty much a project or a case study, the students need to show or combine these levels. You cannot really specify each of them, or you will need like 20, 30 assessment items, and they will be combined in this type of activities. How you do that? You use rubrics, and there are 2 types of rubrics. The first one is holistic, meaning that you look at the overall activity. When you can use this one? When the grading is the goal. So you have pretty much a clear view of the performance, and you know that that performance can be easily measured and showed. And also you want to grade the students for what they did. What you do or what you include in the holistic rubric, you have to look at specific procedure or processes or artifacts. Also, you have to make sure that you identify significant, and this is the point, significant quality attributes, and also you align your numerical values with the quality required for those values. Here is an example, like 5 is the highest, 1 is the lowest, and you can see here the difference between, you know, the highest level and the lowest level, and all the elements in between are clearly described. If you have a 5-point scale, you can use, and this is used very often, you can use descriptor for every level, or you can use descriptor for the highest, mid, and lowest level, and you know, of course the students will infer what's in between. Analytical rubrics are the second type of tools. In this case, your goal is to provide feedback. So you want the students to understand what are their strengths and weaknesses, and also you want to make sure that they improve. So your focus is on helping them to improve. And in this case, the score you will generate, it's only part of the grading strategy. It's not typically a very important part, but it can be a significant part if this is like associated with a significant chunk in their work. What you use here, again, you have to look at observe what you can observe, and you can evaluate if there are artifacts, and typically there are. Also, you have to define what are the portable skills and find the very good scales for each of them, and align again the numerical values with the value of that skill and the quality of the product. Here is an example. This is much more complex. It's not posted here to understand, to read it, but rather to understand that in this case you have several criteria, and for each criteria your scale is from low to high or from high to low. Usually I prefer low to high, so that I'm not suggesting that I expect everybody to be a genius and just get a 4. But there are different preferences, and you can find a lot of resources. Just go and Google rubrics. You'll find examples of rubrics for almost everything. EdTech also can help you with this one. So don't forget, this is when you start your classroom, you have a pretty much a blank sheet, and it's up to you to make sure that this course, this blank sheet, it's filled in the proper manner so that you align whenever you want to measure what are your goals, why you are teaching that class, to what actually you do in the classroom.